In the beginning, life, grace, truth, flesh. These words have a timeless poetry about them, all the more so because we listen to them in the middle of the night amongst these stones and candles on this night. Just as people have listened to them now for centuries, millennia even. In the beginning, life, grace, truth, flesh. The Celts talk about thin places where time seems to stand still and where you feel like you can reach back in time and sense the story of your ancestors behind you. Thin places in Aotearoa tend to be marae or urupa, but also churches or summer batches where childhood memories come flooding back. It might just take the scent of the pahurakawa or the taste of a half-burnt barbecued sausage or the sand between your toes to remind you of carefree summer days when holidays meant holidays with no email or phones to keep you connected. In the beginning, life, grace, truth, flesh. These words at the beginning of John's Gospel also trigger memories and reflections in the lives of people of faith. This tale John is about to weave begins in the beginning of time, back in the creation stories of Genesis, back in ancient times of which no one has any memories. But still they try to reach back with both myth and with science. And so John weaves a tale of life that began in the beginning and now breaks upon the world in a new way. This life comes not in light and stars and sun and moon as life did at the genesis of time, but in flesh, in human flesh, of the ordinary and the everyday. John does not tell us the tale of the baby and the shepherds and the wise men and the angels, but he does tell us the essence of the tale. Jesus, the Word, became flesh and lived among us. God was always incarnate, embodied, enfleshed in the people, but often they couldn't see it. They kept God separated in the Holy of Holies in the temple or somewhere up in the sky. No matter how many times the prophets said, God is here now with the poor and the oppressed and the captives, people thought God was far away and remote and separate. And so the Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus lived in Palestine at a specific time and a specific place. He taught and ate and drank and prayed and healed, and then was killed for his teaching and praying and healing. Yet because he was life, grace, truth, within flesh, death could not be the end for him. And so John wrote his tale of grace and truth, that we might seek grace and truth within ourselves and within each other. God was always incarnate, embodied, enfleshed in the people, and they hadn't seen it. Perhaps now we might. And this life of grace and truth is there for all who seek it, not just in Palestine and not just in Europe, where most of our carols and our Christmas images come from. In Aotearoa, this tale has been told for 200 short years, in other places longer. Each culture and each time takes the story up and embeds it in their culture, in their way. Cardinal Avery Dulles once said, "Christmas does not give us a ladder to climb out of the human condition. It gives us a drill to burrow into the heart of everything that is, and there find it already shimmering with divinity." 200 years ago tomorrow, Reverend Samuel Marsden and Chief Ruatara of Ngāpuhi led the first Christian service in Aotearoa at Oihi in the Bay of Islands. If you were at the 11 p.m. carol service, you will have heard an account read of that day. Secular historians have not been particularly kind to the early Christian missionaries, but more recent writers like Keith Newman have helped to shine a kinder light on their arduous endeavours and their desire to understand and embed the gospel in the culture that they found here. Ruatara had been appallingly treated by 2 ship's captains and left to die twice on Norfolk Island, both times assisted and restored to health by Marsden and his wife Elizabeth. It was from Ruatara that Marsden first learnt the Maori language and began to understand Maori ways. But Ruatara would sadly die only 10 weeks after the first Christmas Day. And we remember him now as Te Ara mo Te Rongopai, the gateway for the good news. You might well know the names of some of the English missionaries, the Williamses, the Colenzos, the Kings, and the Browns. But there are other names. Taumata Akura, Nopera Pana Kareo, Wiremu Nera Ngātai, Minarapa Rangi Hautuke. The young girl Tarori of Waharoa, martyred at 12 years old. Other martyrs, Keriopa and Te Manahera. These are the names of those for whom the gospel became flesh and dwelt in this land. Before too long, the first Maori Anglican priest, Roto Waitoa, was ordained in 1853. Te Aute College in Hawke's Bay opened in 1854. This tale of life, grace, truth within flesh does not belong to one culture or one time. It calls out to us as it did 200 years ago in Oihi. It calls out to us today in Bethlehem, where pilgrims must get past the shameful separation wall to get to worship. It calls out to us today in northern Iraq, where after 2,000 years of Christian worship, no church communities can gather any longer to hear it. It calls out to us today in Peshawar, Pakistan, the Sudan, Liberia, Sydney, the Philippines, Tonga, anywhere that you might like to name. It calls out to us here this night, in the dark, amongst these stones. It calls out to us even though we witness the atrocities of children killed in Peshawar, Pakistan, even though someone in Sydney can be shot for going to get a cup of coffee. Even though, and especially, it calls out to us when we suffer and we are sad. The question for us here tonight is, how does this tale of life, grace, truth become enfleshed in our lives? This Christmas, can we burrow into our hearts and the hearts of those we know and love and find there some divinity? And then can we look to those we do not know and see the light of grace, truth, life, enfleshed there as well? In the beginning was the Word, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, full of grace and full of truth.